The pre-dawn darkness of February 19th, 1945 hung like a shroud over the Pacific as Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the largest armada ever assembled in the Pacific theater prepare for what would become one of the bloodiest battles in United States Marine Corps history. Through his binoculars, the volcanic silhouette of Jima emerged from the morning mist, a pork-chop-shaped island of black sand and sulfurous rock that would soon be baptized in blood. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the legendary Howlin' Mad Smith, had warned his commanders that this would be different from previous island campaigns. Intelligence reports suggested that General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander, had transformed the 8-square-mile island into an impregnable fortress. Unlike previous Pacific battles where Japanese forces had met American landings at the beaches, Kuribayashi had adopted a strategy of defense in depth, allowing the Marines to land before unleashing hell from carefully concealed positions. The morning bombardment began at 600 hours, as battleships New York, Texas, Nevada, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Idaho unleashed their massive guns upon the seemingly lifeless island. For 3 hours, the thunder of naval artillery echoed across the Pacific, sending tons of high-explosive shells into the volcanic rock. Carrier-based aircraft from Task Force 58 added their contribution, diving through anti-aircraft fire to deliver bombs and rockets onto suspected enemy positions. As referenced in James Bradley's comprehensive account, Flags of Our Fathers, the pre-invasion intelligence had severely underestimated the Japanese defensive preparations. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, watched through his field glasses as the first wave of landing craft approached the black beaches of the island's southern shore. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, nearly 70,000 Marines, were about to face an enemy that had spent months preparing for this moment. The volcanic sand proved treacherous from the first footstep. Marines struggled up the steep beaches, their boots sinking deep into the loose black granules that made every step a monumental effort. Equipment bogged down, vehicles became trapped, and the careful landing schedules began to deteriorate within minutes of the first wave hitting the beach. Private First Class James Robeson of the 5th Marine Division later recalled the eerie silence that greeted their landing. Where previous campaigns had seen immediate and fierce resistance at the water's edge, Iwo Jima offered only the whisper of sulfurous wind and the distant rumble of the ongoing bombardment against the island's interior. This unnatural quiet filled the Marines with an ominous sense of foreboding. Colonel Harry Liversedge's 28th Marines landed on the left flank with orders to cut across the narrow neck of the island and isolate Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano that dominated the southern tip. Meanwhile, Colonel Chester Graham's 26th Marines and Colonel Thomas Warnham's 27th Marines pushed toward the center of the island, their objective being the all-important Airfield No. 1. The deception lasted exactly 47 minutes. At 925 hours, the island erupted in a symphony of death as Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened fire from positions that had remained invisible during the 3-day preliminary bombardment. The black sand that had hindered the Marines' advance now became their salvation, as men dove for cover in shell holes and behind the few pieces of equipment that had made it inland. The revelation of General Kuribayashi's defensive masterpiece became horrifyingly clear as the first day's casualties mounted into the hundreds. The Japanese commander had abandoned the traditional banzai charge tactics that had proven futile in previous island campaigns, instead creating an intricate network of bunkers, tunnels, and fortified positions that turned every yard of advance into a deadly puzzle. Kuribayashi's engineering feat was nothing short of diabolical. His forces had spent 8 months carving 16 miles of tunnels through the volcanic rock, creating interconnected defensive positions that could provide mutual support and allow defenders to disappear and reappear like deadly phantoms. Every cave entrance was carefully camouflaged, every firing position calculated for maximum effect against advancing Marines. The 28th Marines' advance toward Mount Suribachi proved particularly costly. The extinct volcano, rising 554 feet above the landing beaches, had been transformed into a fortress within a fortress. Colonel Liversedge's men faced not only the natural advantages of elevated terrain, but also an elaborate system of defensive positions that Kuribayashi's engineers had blasted into the volcanic rock. Sergeant John Basilone, the Medal of Honor recipient from Guadalcanal, had volunteered to return to combat after spending months on war bond tours across the United States. On February 19th, the legendary Marine led his machine gun section in the assault against Japanese positions near the base of Suribachi. When a mortar round landed directly on his position, the Marine Corps lost one of its greatest heroes, and the men of Charlie Company lost their inspiration. As noted in historian Joseph Alexander's definitive work, Closing In, Marines in the Seizure of Iwo Jima, the Japanese defensive strategy proved devastatingly effective against conventional Marine tactics. Units that had successfully island-hopped across the Pacific found themselves stalled within sight of their landing beaches, unable to advance more than a few hundred yards against the withering fire from invisible positions. The Marines adapted with characteristic ingenuity and determination. Flamethrower teams became the spearhead of every advance, their terrifying weapons proving effective against bunkers that had withstood direct hits from naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. Tank infantry teams developed new tactics, using Sherman tanks as mobile shields, while infantrymen worked close enough to assault individual positions with satchel charges and grenades. Private First Class. Franklin Sousley of the 3rd Platoon, Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, found himself in the thick of the advance toward Suribachi's base. The 19-year-old from Kentucky had joined the Marines straight from his family's farm, and the volcanic wasteland of Iwo Jima seemed like another planet compared to the rolling hills of his home state. The cost of each small advance became measured not in yards, but in lives. Companies that had landed with full strength found themselves reduced to platoon size within hours. The black sand, initially seen as merely an obstacle to movement, became a constant reminder of mortality as it mixed with the blood of fallen Marines to create a grim paste that clung to everything. Medical corpsmen performed miracles of courage and skill under impossible conditions. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class. John Bradley moved through the killing fields with complete disregard for his own safety, treating wounded Marines under direct fire from Japanese positions. His medical bag became as familiar to the Marines of Easy Company as their own rifles, a symbol of hope in the midst of mechanized death. By nightfall on February 19th, the 5th Amphibious Corps had established a beachhead approximately 3,000 yards long and between 300 and 1,000 yards deep. The cost had been severe, over 2,500 Marine casualties in a single day, making it one of the bloodiest days in Corps history. The second day of the battle dawned with the same sulphurous haze that had greeted the initial landing, but now the acrid smoke of battle mixed with the natural volcanic vapors to create an atmosphere that seemed torn from Dante's deepest circle of hell. Colonel Harry Liversedge's 28th Marines faced the daunting task of isolating Mount Suribachi, while the remainder of the 5th Amphibious Corps pushed north toward the heavily fortified airfields. The volcanic terrain proved as formidable an enemy as the Japanese defenders themselves. The loose black sand continued to swallow equipment and exhaust men with every step, while the rocky northern highlands offered countless opportunities for concealed defensive positions. Each ridgeline, each rocky outcrop, each seemingly innocent fold in the ground potentially concealed death in the form of carefully sighted machine guns, mortars, or anti-tank guns. Sergeant Michael Strank, the squad leader of 2nd Squad, Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, embodied the kind of leadership that made the Marine Corps legendary. The 24-year-old from Pennsylvania had survived Bougainville and was known for his ability to keep his men alive while accomplishing the mission. As his squad advanced toward the base of Suribachi, Strank's tactical experience and calm under fire became a beacon of stability for the younger Marines in his charge. The Japanese defenders fought with a fanaticism that impressed even hardened Marine veterans. General Kuribayashi had indoctrinated his men with the concept of gyokusai, death before dishonor, but had coupled this traditional warrior ethos with modern defensive tactics that maximized the cost of every American advance. His men fought from positions until they were physically overwhelmed, then withdrew through the tunnel system to fight again from secondary positions. Corporal Harlan Block, another member of Easy Company's 2nd Squad, found himself part of a war unlike anything the Marine Corps had previously experienced. The 20-year-old from Texas had played football in high school and possessed the physical strength and competitive spirit that served him well in the close-quarters combat that characterized the fight for Iwo Jima. Each bunker assault required the kind of teamwork and individual courage that separated Marines from ordinary soldiers. As documented in Richard Wheeler's detailed account, Iwo, the Marines developed increasingly sophisticated tactics for reducing Japanese strongpoints. Tank infantry coordination reached new levels of effectiveness as Sherman tank crews learned to provide precise fire support, while Marine assault teams maneuvered to attack positions from multiple angles simultaneously. Private First Class Ira Hayes, the Pima Indian from Arizona who served in Easy Company's 3rd Squad, experienced combat that tested every aspect of his training and character. The 22-year-old paratrooper had volunteered for the Marines to serve his country, and the fight for Iwo Jima represented the ultimate test of that commitment. His quiet competence and steady nerves made him a valuable member of his squad during the increasingly desperate fighting. The Marines' advance was measured in yards gained at tremendous cost. Each day brought incremental progress toward objectives that seemed tantalizingly close, but required the systematic reduction of dozens of individual defensive positions. The black sand that had initially hindered movement became trampled into a firm surface by the passage of thousands of Marines, but it also became mixed with the debris of war and the remains of those who had fallen. Communication between units became increasingly difficult as radio equipment fell victim to the volcanic sand and enemy fire. Runners carried messages between positions under fire, and visual signals became critical for coordinating attacks. The primitive conditions of the battlefield stood in stark contrast to the sophisticated equipment and tactics that had brought the Marines across the Pacific. By February 21st, the 28th Marines had succeeded in cutting across the narrow neck of the island, effectively isolating Mount Suribachi from potential reinforcement. However, the cost had been severe, with battalion-sized units reduced to company strength and companies reduced to platoon size. The volcanic fortress still loomed over the southern beaches, its hidden guns continuing to make resupply operations hazardous for the ships offshore. February 23, 1945 dawned with a clarity that seemed to mock the carnage of the previous 4 days of fighting. Mount Suribachi, the volcanic sentinel that had dominated the southern end of Iwo Jima, stood silhouetted against the morning sky like a monument to human determination and sacrifice. Colonel Harry Liversedge's 28th Marines had finally fought their way to the base of the extinct volcano and now faced the ultimate challenge of scaling its steep slopes under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, received orders to take a patrol to the summit and secure the highest point on the southern end of the island. The mission fell to Easy Company, whose ranks had been decimated during the previous days of fighting, but whose spirit remained unbroken. First Lieutenant Harold Schreier would lead the 40-man patrol, carrying with them a small American flag that Johnson had obtained from the battalion's transport. The ascent began at 800 hours, with Marines climbing the steep volcanic slopes while maintaining constant vigilance for enemy positions. The Japanese defenders had honeycombed Suribachi with defensive positions, and every cave mouth, every rocky outcrop, every fold in the terrain could conceal death. Sergeant Michael Strank led his squad up the treacherous slopes, his experienced eye constantly scanning for signs of enemy activity. The climb proved less opposed than expected, a testament to the effectiveness of the previous 4 days of fighting that had systematically reduced the Japanese defensive positions on the mountain's lower slopes. However, the Marines moved with the caution of men who had learned that Iwo Jima could turn deadly without warning. Each step up the loose volcanic rock brought them closer to their objective, but also deeper into potential enemy territory. As referenced in James Bradley's meticulously researched Flags of Our Fathers, the patrol reached the summit at approximately 10:20 hours, finding the highest point of Suribachi defended by only a handful of Japanese soldiers, who were quickly overwhelmed. The Marines established a defensive perimeter around the summit while searching for a suitable location to plant the American flag that would signal to the troops below that the mountain had been conquered. The first flag raising occurred at 10:30 hours, with Lieutenant Schreier and 5 other Marines raising the small banner on a piece of Japanese pipe they had found among the debris on the summit. The sight of the stars and stripes flying over Mount Suribachi electrified the Marines fighting below and the sailors aboard the ships offshore. Cheers echoed across the black beaches as men who had endured days of hell saw tangible proof of American progress. However, Colonel Johnson decided that the first flag was too small to be seen clearly from the northern end of the island, where the bulk of the fighting continued. He dispatched Sergeant Louis Lowry to photograph the first flag raising for historical records, then ordered a larger flag to be brought to the summit for a second ceremony that would provide better visibility and photographic opportunities. The second flag-raising party included Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private First Class Ira Hayes, Hospital Corpsman Third Class John Bradley, and Private First Class Rene Gagnon. These 6 men, representing the diverse backgrounds and unified purpose of the American military, gathered around a heavier piece of pipe to raise a larger flag that would become one of the most famous images in American history. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal had climbed to the summit specifically to capture the flag-raising ceremony. His camera captured the precise moment when the 6 Marines strained against the weight of the flagpole, their bodies forming a composition that perfectly embodied the American spirit of determination and sacrifice. The photograph would later become the basis for the Marine Corps War Memorial and one of the most recognizable images of World War II. The flag raising provided a tremendous morale boost for the American forces, but it represented only the conquest of Mount Suribachi, not the entire island. The bulk of Iwo Jima remained in Japanese hands, and General Kuribayashi's main defensive positions in the northern highlands remained largely intact. The most difficult fighting still lay ahead, but the sight of the American flag flying over the volcanic peak provided psychological momentum that would prove invaluable in the battles to come. The conquest of Mount Suribachi had cost the 28th Marines dearly, but it eliminated the threat of observed artillery fire against the landing beaches and provided American forces with a commanding observation post overlooking the entire southern end of the island. The victory proved that even the most formidable Japanese defensive positions could be overcome through sustained courage and tactical competence. The euphoria of raising the flag over Mount Suribachi lasted exactly as long as it took for the reality of the situation to reassert itself. While the 28th Marines had conquered the volcanic peak, the vast majority of General Kuribayashi's defensive network remained intact throughout the northern two-thirds of Iwo Jima. The real test of American resolve was about to begin in the Rocky Highlands, where the Japanese commander had positioned his most formidable defenses. Major General Harry Schmidt's 5th Amphibious Corps now faced the daunting task of advancing across terrain that seemed specifically designed to favor defensive operations. The northern portion of the island consisted of a series of ridges, ravines, and rocky outcrops that provided countless opportunities for concealed positions. Every advance would require the systematic reduction of defensive positions that had been months in the making. The 4th Marine Division, under Major General Clifton Cates, found itself facing the most heavily fortified section of the Japanese defensive line. The approaches to Airfield Number 2 were covered by interlocking fields of fire from positions that had been blasted from solid rock and reinforced with concrete and steel. Each bunker had been positioned to provide mutual support with its neighbors, creating a defensive network that could continue functioning even after individual positions were overrun. Colonel John Antonelli's 23rd Marines spearheaded the 4th Division's advance against what Marines grimly dubbed the Meat Grinder, a complex of defensive positions anchored by Hill 362 Able, Hill 362 Baker, and Hill 362 Charlie. These rocky prominences had been transformed into virtual fortresses by Kuribayashi's engineers, with underground chambers connected by tunnels and protected by multiple layers of defensive positions. The fighting for these positions exceeded even the desperate battles that had characterized the conquest of Mount Suribachi. Japanese defenders fought with fanatical determination from positions that seemed impervious to conventional weapons. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment, which had proven effective against surface positions, had little impact on bunkers that had been carved from solid rock and protected by multiple layers of overhead cover. As documented in historian Bill Ross's comprehensive account, Iwo Jima, Legacy of Valor, the Marines adapted their tactics to meet the unique challenges of the Northern Highlands. Tank infantry teams became the primary assault formation, with Sherman tanks providing direct fire support against bunker apertures, while Marine assault teams maneuvered to attack positions with satchel charges, flamethrowers, and grenades. The casualty rates in the Meat Grinder exceeded anything the Marine Corps had previously experienced. Companies were reduced to squad size within hours, and battalions required constant reinforcement to maintain even minimal combat effectiveness. The black volcanic sand that had initially hindered operations now became mixed with the debris of battle and the blood of fallen Marines to create a landscape that seemed torn from a nightmare. Private First Class Tony Stein of the 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, had fashioned a unique weapon from the machine gun of a crashed Navy fighter aircraft. His improvised automatic weapon proved devastatingly effective against Japanese positions, but it also made him a prime target for enemy fire. Despite being wounded multiple times, Stein continued to lead attacks against enemy positions until he was killed while attempting to rescue wounded Marines. The 3rd Marine Division, under Major General Graves Erskine, advanced up the center of the island toward Airfield Number 2 and the town of Motoyama. The division's 9th Marines encountered particularly stiff resistance as they approached the main Japanese defensive line, which had been positioned to take advantage of every natural defensive feature the terrain offered. Colonel Howard Kenyon's 9th Marines found themselves engaged in a battle of inches, with each day's advance measured in yards rather than miles. The rocky terrain channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones, where Japanese defenders could concentrate their fire with devastating effect. Every cave mouth, every rocky crevice, every fold in the ground had to be individually cleared by Marines who faced death with each step forward. The psychological strain of the fighting began to take its toll on even the most experienced Marines. The constant threat of death from invisible enemies, the horrific casualties among friends and comrades, and the seemingly endless nature of the advance created conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. Medical corpsmen reported increasing numbers of combat fatigue cases as the battle wore on. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class John Bradley, who had participated in the famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi, continued to serve with Easy Company as the unit moved north to participate in the assault against the main Japanese defensive line. His medical skills and courage under fire had already saved dozens of Marine lives, but the fighting in the Northern Highlands would test his abilities to their utmost limits. By March 10, 1945, the battle for Iwo Jima had transformed into a grinding war of attrition that tested every aspect of American military capability. The initial optimistic estimates of a 5-day campaign had been shattered by the reality of General Kuribayashi's defensive masterpiece, and Major General Harry Schmidt's 5th Amphibious Corps found itself locked in the most costly battle in Marine Corps history. The Japanese commander had abandoned any hope of victory in the conventional sense, instead focusing on extracting the maximum cost in American blood for every yard of volcanic soil. His strategy of defense in depth had forced the Marines to fight for every cave, every bunker, every rocky outcrop on an island that measured only 8 square miles but contained 16 miles of interconnected tunnels and defensive positions. Colonel Vernon McGee's 3rd Marine Division had finally secured Airfield No. 2 after days of desperate fighting, but the cost had been enormous. The division's battalions had been reduced to company size, and companies existed more as administrative units than tactical formations. The constant need for replacements had diluted the veteran leadership that had carried the Marines across the Pacific, forcing inexperienced junior officers to assume responsibilities normally handled by seasoned professionals. The 5th Marine Division, under Major General Keller Rocky, continued its advance up the western coast of the island toward the final Japanese strongholds in the northern highlands. The division's 26 Marines encountered increasingly desperate resistance as they approached positions that Kuribayashi had designated as his final defensive line. These positions had been fortified with particular care, as the Japanese commander intended them to be his army's final stand. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers's 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines, found itself assigned to Assault Hill 262, a rocky prominence that commanded the approaches to the northern end of the island. The hill's slopes had been honeycombed with defensive positions that seemed to sprout machine gun nests and mortar positions like deadly flowers. Each assault revealed new defensive positions that had remained hidden during previous attacks. As noted in Robert Leckey's classic account, Strong Men Armed, the Marines had developed into the most effective assault troops in the world through their Pacific campaigns, but Iwo Jima presented challenges that exceeded even their considerable capabilities. The combination of fanatical enemy resistance, treacherous terrain, and sophisticated defensive positions created conditions that pushed American tactical doctrine to its limits. The battle had also taken a severe toll on Japanese forces, though their casualties remained largely hidden in the underground defensive positions. General Kuribayashi's communications with Imperial headquarters had become increasingly sporadic as American advances severed communication lines and reduced his defensive perimeter. However, the Japanese resistance showed no signs of weakening, and individual positions continued to fight until physically overwhelmed. The Marines had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for reducing individual defensive positions. Combined arms teams consisting of tanks, however, each position required individual attention, making progress slow and casualties inevitable. Corporal Tony Stein's posthumous Medal of Honor citation noted that he had single-handedly destroyed numerous enemy positions while repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to rescue wounded Marines. His sacrifice, multiplied by thousands of similar acts of heroism, had enabled the American advance to continue despite seemingly impossible odds. The northern highlands of Iwo Jima had become a moonscape of shell craters, destroyed vegetation, and abandoned equipment. The black volcanic sand mixed with the debris of battle to create a wasteland that bore little resemblance to the tropical islands that had characterized previous Pacific campaigns. This was warfare reduced to its most elemental level, where courage and determination mattered more than sophisticated equipment or tactical doctrine. Medical facilities on the beach had expanded into small cities as the casualty rates continued to mount. Hospital ships offshore worked around the clock to evacuate wounded Marines to hospitals in Guam and Pearl Harbor, while replacement drafts arrived daily to fill the gaps in units that had been decimated by the fighting. By March 15th, American forces controlled approximately 90% of Iwo Jima, but the remaining Japanese positions continued to exact a terrible toll on advancing Marines. The end was clearly in sight, but General Kuribayashi's final defensive positions promised to make the last phase of the battle as costly as everything that had preceded it. The final phase of the Battle of Iwo Jima began on March 21, 1945, as Major General Harry Schmidt's decimated 5th Amphibious Corps prepared to eliminate the last organized resistance in the island's northern highlands. General Kuribayashi had withdrawn his surviving forces into a final defensive perimeter centered around a rocky gorge that Marines had nicknamed Death Valley, where he intended to make his ultimate stand against the American advance. The Japanese commander, who had been promoted to full general during the battle, still commanded approximately 300 effective soldiers, who remained determined to extract maximum casualties from their final defensive positions. These positions had been prepared with particular care, as Kuribayashi knew they would be his army's last opportunity to inflict damage on American forces before the inevitable conclusion of the battle. Colonel Howard Kenyon's 9th Marines led the assault into Death Valley, supported by the remaining tanks and artillery that had survived the brutal campaign. The Marines advanced with the weary determination of men who had endured hell for over a month and could see the end of their ordeal within reach. However, Kuribayashi's final positions proved as deadly as any his forces had previously occupied. The fighting in Death Valley exceeded even the desperate battles that had characterized the entire Iwo Jima campaign. Japanese soldiers fought from positions until physically overwhelmed, then detonated explosive charges that often killed both defenders and attackers. The rocky terrain channeled American advances into predetermined killing zones, where Kuribayashi could concentrate his remaining firepower with devastating effect. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, the young Marine from Kentucky who had participated in the famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi, was killed by a Japanese sniper on March 21st, while serving with Easy Company in the final assault. His death, coming so close to the end of the battle, epitomized the cruel nature of warfare that continued to claim lives even as victory became inevitable. As documented in James Bradley's Flags of Our Fathers, the cost of the Battle of Iwo Jima had far exceeded all pre-invasion estimates. American casualties totaled over 28,000, including nearly 7,000 killed in action. The casualty rate among Marine infantry units approached 80%, making Iwo Jima proportionally the costliest battle in Marine Corps history. Hospital Corpsman Third Class John Bradley, who had also participated in the flag-raising ceremony, continued to serve with distinction during the final phase of the battle. His medical skills and courage under fire had saved dozens of Marine lives throughout the campaign, earning him the Navy Cross and the eternal gratitude of the Marines he had served. However, he was wounded by shrapnel during the final week of fighting and evacuated to a hospital ship. General Kuribayashi's final message to Imperial Headquarters, transmitted on March 23rd, reported that his forces had been reduced to fewer than 100 effective soldiers, but would continue fighting to the end. The Japanese commander had exceeded all expectations in his defense of Iwo Jima, transforming what was expected to be a brief campaign into a month-long ordeal that had tested American resolve to its limits. The organized resistance on Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945, when the last confirmed Japanese defensive position was overrun by Marines of the 5th Division. However, individual Japanese soldiers continued to emerge from hidden positions for weeks after the official end of the battle, requiring constant vigilance from American garrison forces. The strategic value of Iwo Jima became apparent within weeks of its conquest, as Army Air Force P-51 Mustang fighters began operating from the island's captured airfields to provide escort coverage for B-29 bombing raids against Japan. The island also served as an emergency landing field for damaged bombers returning from missions over the Japanese home islands, potentially saving hundreds of American aircrew lives. The human cost of the victory had been staggering. Of the approximately 22,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 200 survived to be taken prisoner. The Japanese casualty rate approached 99%, testimony to the fanatical determination with which they had defended their positions. General Kuribayashi's body was never definitively identified, though he was presumed to have died during the final phase of the fighting. The Battle of Iwo Jima had demonstrated both the incredible courage of American Marines and the terrible cost of victory against a determined enemy fighting from prepared positions. The iconic photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of American determination and sacrifice, but the reality behind the image was far more complex and costly than most Americans ever understood. The lessons learned at Iwo Jima influenced American planning for the proposed invasion of Japan itself, contributing to the decision to use atomic weapons rather than face the prospect of similar casualties on a much larger scale. The island that had been intended as a stepping stone to victory had instead become a preview of the terrible cost that conventional victory over Japan would entail. The Battle of Iwo Jima earned its place in the annals of Marine Corps history, not just for the famous flag-raising photograph, but for the incredible display of courage, determination, and sacrifice by ordinary Americans who accomplished an extraordinary mission under impossible conditions. Their legacy continues to inspire Marines today, serving as a reminder that freedom's price is measured not in dollars or equipment, but in the blood and courage of those willing to pay it.